It's Ash from Super Videos, back for another video for The Walking Dead. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at a scene from the latest episode that aired on AMC Premiere, Season 11, Episode 14, which was called The Rotten Core. If you haven't watched that episode, you probably don't want to watch this video because I will be going through some moments from that episode, so if you haven't watched it, it will spoil it for you. So that scene that we're going to talk about could potentially be a story setup for things that are going to be coming up in Isle of the Dead, which is the spin-off between Maggie and Negan. There is actually a big clue in the moments that we're going to look at that leads me to think that they might be doing an adaptation of the comic storyline, but it'll be slightly different in a way that doesn't involve Carl or even Judith, but Hershel Jr. And it'll happen not in The Walking Dead, but in Isle of the Dead, the new spin-off with Negan and Maggie. So stay tuned, we'll be right back to break this down. As always, before we jump into this, smash that like button, subscribe to join our community, and press the bell to be notified when I upload on the channel. With that said, let's waste no more time and dive right in. In the latest episode that aired on AMC Premiere, Season 11, Episode 14, called The Rotten Core, we did have a very awesome, emotional, and deep scene with Hershel Jr. and Negan. Obviously, Hershel Jr. grabbed a gun, pointed it at Negan, and threatened to kill him. Well, he didn't really threaten to kill him, but he wanted to kill him, let's just say that. But then Negan talked him down from doing that, saying that even though he does deserve to be killed for what he did to Hershel, particularly killing his dad and pretty much destroying that whole family in a way, he doesn't think that the people that are there deserve that, because if Hershel Jr. shoots Negan, then the bad guys are gonna show up and everyone's gonna die. But I did find it very interesting that it didn't end here. Like, they circled things around at the very end of the episode. But before I get there, I also thought it was extremely cool and interesting that the survivors that are in Negan's new camp were listening. Because if you really think about it, Annie, Negan's wife now, told Negan that these people trust Negan the most after their former leader was killed. Obviously, we know Annie knows what Negan did, and I'm assuming that the people in Negan's new camp also know what Negan did. But for them to witness this firsthand, how Negan dealt with a situation like this, I think only makes Negan a stronger leader in their eyes, and they trust him even more. So I love that kind of layer that they added into the story. But going back to Negan and Hershel Jr., at the end of the episode, Negan approached Hershel Jr. and told him that there's things to settle between the two of them. He did make him a promise, telling him that when he's much older, he can actually come find Negan and they'll officially settle it. Negan basically giving Hershel Jr. the green light to come kill him or confront him about what he did to Glenn when Hershel Jr. is much older. And as we saw in that scene, it appeared that Negan was genuine with that promise, and he actually meant every word of it. Now, you may ask, why didn't they just settle it there? Well, for one, then there would be no story. And then two, Negan has a new family of his own. He has a wife and a baby on the way. We don't know if Negan knows about the baby, but I'm assuming he does. So he's not just gonna kind of volunteer to die. He's gonna want to kick the can down the road and kind of delay the whole thing as much as he can. And obviously, when Maggie gets back, she asks Hershel Jr., what did Negan tell you? And obviously, Hershel Jr. just looks at Negan but doesn't say anything, and Negan kind of makes eye contact with the two of them but then looks away as if he's really ashamed, and he doesn't really feel comfortable being in this situation that he's in. But now with that, let's talk about how they could do a remixed version of the comic storyline and how this whole thing could have been set up for Isle of the Dead. Obviously, in the comic book, at the very end, we have Carl reading the story of his father, Rick Grimes, to his kid. At this point in the TV adaptation, they can't do that because Carl is not in the story. Everything is up in the air with Rick. But what they could do is, instead of just giving this to Judith and making it work somehow, they could give it to Hershel Jr. instead. Have like some sort of a time jump, something similar to what they did in the comics, but instead of a 20-year time jump like the comics, they could have like a 10-year time jump, or 5 years or 6 years. But have it such that Hershel Jr. is now, let's say, 19 or 20. And instead of the comics where Carl is reading a story about Rick to his kid, but Maggie reading the story of Glenn to Hershel Jr. It's at that point where you could circle things back around to what happened between Hershel Jr. and Negan, and have it such that maybe Hershel Jr. decides he's old enough to a point where he wants to go find Negan and settle things, so that Negan could fulfill the promise that he once made him all those years ago. And then you could have Maggie and Hershel Jr., a much older Hershel Jr. obviously, heading towards where Negan's group was the last time that they saw them. And maybe there they could find a note from Negan telling them where he went, and that would be kind of set up for the story that they could continue in Isle of the Dead. And then when they're doing that whole story in Isle of the Dead, they could bring in aspects of the Rick Grimes stuff and the CRM and add it on top of it. Like the whole story wouldn't be CRM related, but maybe Hershel Jr. and Maggie do find some CRM soldiers or even hints about Rick or something like that on their way to find Negan. So that could be a very interesting way to have the story go to the direction that everyone thinks it's gonna go, but still integrate some moments that was set up in the episode, and even remix the comic storyline in a way that actually works and feels natural. But I'm definitely interested to know everyone's thoughts and opinions about this. Do you think that what they did in that last episode between Hershel Jr. and Negan was set up for Isle of the Dead? Or do you think that there's no connection and that they're gonna do something completely different? So share your thoughts and opinions down in the comment section below. Smash that like button, subscribe to join our community, and press the bell to be notified when I upload on the channel. That's it for this video. See you next time for another super video.